Good morning, honors. Mrs. Latham here. This is week 6 of distance learning, and this week we are going to be looking at section 8.5 and 8.6 from our Algebra 1 textbook, and it's mainly going to be focusing on factoring ax squared plus bx plus c. So, previously in 8.1, we had practiced factoring out a greatest common factor. So before we get into factoring, I do want to practice this. If we're looking at number 1, if I want to compare each term. So the first term I'm going to look at is my 18x squared. Okay, when I go to factor this, we are going to break it up into its multiples. So 18 can be broken down into 2 times 9. But I can even break that down, the 9, by 3's. And then x squared is going to give me 2 x's. I can even do the same for 12x. I can break that down. So 12 would be 2 times 6. And then 6 could be 2 times 3. And then we have 1x. And then as for my negative 36, that would be 6 and 6. Or 2 and 3, 2 and 3. And then 1's going to be negative. So that's like negative 1 times 2 times 2 times 3 times 3, and there's no x. Now the greatest common factor, we want to look at what they have in common. So if you notice, they all have a 2. And they all have a 3. So that's the only thing they have in common, right? This one has an extra 3, this one has an extra 3, the middle one, the purple one, doesn't. The top one has 2 x's, the middle one has 1 x, the last one doesn't have any x's, and then only 2 of them have 2's. So 2 times 3 is our greatest common factor. So we could say that, right? Our greatest common factor is 6, but we haven't finished, right? The key thing is it says factor it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull 6 out of each thing. So if I pull out 6, I'm going to be left with, what's there, right? So here I'm going to be left with 3x squared. Here I'm going to be left with 2x. And then for the pink, I'm going to be left with negative 6. So that is our factored form. Looking at the second one, I could break it up the same way. So here I have negative 1 times 2 and then 5 x's. For the middle one, it is negative 1 again times 2, and then 2 times 4 gives me 8. So I'm going to multiply it by 2 more 2's, and then I have 3 x's. Then here, for the last one, again, negative 1 times 2 times 2 times x. And if you notice, again, they all have some stuff in common. First of all, they all have a negative 1. They all have a 2. And they all have an x. Actually, they all have 2 x's. So our greatest common factor here is going to be negative 2. Let me move this over. So our greatest common factor is going to be negative 2x squared. So that's what we're going to pull out. Okay, so going back, right? If I go back up to my top row, I'm only left with 3 x's, so x cubed. Looking at my second row, I'm left with 2 2's and an x, so that's going to give me 4x. And then my second row, all I have left is a positive 2. Now it's really important we factor out that negative 1 because each term was negative. So that is a piece that we can pull out. And think about standard form. In standard form, we always want our first value to be positive. And so in this case, our first value is here, and it is positive. Okay, So we're going to be looking at factoring ax squared plus 11x plus 2. And what we want to do is we want to write it as two binomials being multiplied. So we spent 8(2) through 8(4) looking at binomials such as this, and multiplying them using FOIL or the table method to figure out what they equal. Well, now we want to do the exact opposite of that. So I'm going to walk you through the steps using this example. So the first step says find the product of AC. So I know that product means multiplication, and AC. So if I'm thinking about my form, this is AX plus BX plus C. So AC must be my terms here. So AC in this case is going to be 5 times 2. Now we're not including the x's, okay? We're just looking at the values. So 5 times 2 gives us 10. Then it says determine which factor pairs have a sum of B. Well, first of all, my B value is 11. So we need to come up with factor pairs that have a sum of B. And the easiest way is, I think, is making a table. So if I take the number 10, I want to think of all the numbers that could be a factor of 10. So that could be 1 and 10. That could be 2 and 5. Now we could also look at negatives, but since B is positive, I'm not going to worry about negatives. Now if I look at these, I want to see what could add up to. Remember, that's what sum means. So sum is addition. What two things could add up to 11? So if we're looking, 1 and 10, if I was to add these, they add up to 11. So my factor pair is 1 and 10. So now what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this trinomial so it has those two new terms. So what we're doing is we're splitting our middle value, the 11x, and simply rewriting it. So if I go to rewrite this, my 5x squared is unaffected. And then when I split up 11x, I'm going to do 10 first. So it's 10x plus x plus 2. So if you notice, 10x plus x, that gives me 11x. It's still the same thing, just written differently. This is a polynomial instead of a trinomial. This isn't simplified. Then it says factor out the greatest common factor of each pair. So what they mean by that is we have 4 numbers or 4 monomials. We can actually group them. So that's what I'm doing up top here. I'm grouping them. I'm kind of splitting them in half. And we can factor these now. So this is kind of what we were just doing before. So if I'm looking at my first group, my 5x squared plus 10x, what I notice is that the only thing I can pull out from this is going to be a 5 and an x. That's what they have in common. So when I pull out 5x, I am now left with x plus 2. Now, if we're looking at the second one, I can't really pull anything out, right? X and 2 have nothing in common. But what they do have in common is the number 1. So I am going to pull out a 1, and x plus 2 kind of stays the same here. Now, if you notice, they're both being multiplied by x plus 2. Those are my dogs, sorry. So being multiplied by x plus 2. So we can actually now rewrite this, right? Think about how we used to distribute each term to each binomial. So that's kind of the same idea. We're going to undo that. So we could say that 5x plus 1 times x plus 2 is our binomial. Okay? So 5x plus 1 times x plus 2 is our binomial. We have factored this out. And if we had gone ahead and if we used FOIL or the table method, we will end up with our same answer. So these are the 4 main steps to factoring. I highly recommend writing these down. I would write down this example. That way you can reference it, because when you guys go to do your slides this week, I'm really going to be looking at, did you do this correctly? So, and with the correct steps. So let's do some practicing. So the 8.5 was looking at when A is always 1. And what's great about that is that it makes it quite simple, because when we find our AC, it's always going to actually be our C value, because A's are always 1. So I can automatically go up to the first one, and I can tell you for a fact that my AC value is 15. And mainly because A is 1, so if I do 1 times 15, I get 15. Now I'm going to break up 15 into its parts. So I know it's 1 and 15, 3 and 5. And I think that's it. So now looking at these 2 options, what's going to add up to 8x? Well, 3 and 5 add up to 8, so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to rewrite it. So I have x squared plus 3x plus 5x plus 15. So we split 8x. Now I'm going to factor out my pairs. So if you notice in the first one, I can pull out an x, and I'm left with x plus 3. In the second one, I can pull out a 5, and I'm left with x plus 3. And I know I factored these right because we end up getting the same thing inside the parentheses. If you get it where they're not the same number or the same variable in number, any of those combinations, that means you're not pulling out enough. That means you have to pull out something else. They need to be the same, otherwise you're not doing it correctly. And then the last step, we're going to rewrite it. So x plus 5 times x plus 3. And we're done. Looking at the second one, our AC value still going to be 1 times 24, which is 24. So this time I want you guys to notice that our B value here is negative. So that means that when I go to write 24, one of my values needs to be negative. That way I know I'm getting a negative B value. So let me just write them as positives and then kind of like play with them a little bit. So we could do 1 and 24. So that could be negative 1 and positive 24. That could be negative 24 and 1. We could also do negative 2 and 12, or negative 12 and positive 2. And right now, none of these options are working. So we're going to have to keep going. So if we think about it, 3 times 8 also works. So what if we did negative 3 and 8? Oh, you know what I just realized, guys? My AC value is positive. So what that means is all my numbers have to be negative. So this is actually negative, negative, negative. There we go. That makes more sense. Okay, so negative 1 times negative 24 gives me a positive 24. They do not add up to negative 11. Negative 2, negative 12 multiplied to 24 do not add up to negative 11. But negative 3 times negative 8 gives me 24 and adds up to negative 11. So I'm going to split the middle with those 2 terms. So we have x squared minus 3x minus 8x plus 24. Then I can factor. So notice my x is positive, so I'm not going to pull out a negative here. I can only pull out an x, and we get x minus 3. Over here, same kind of over here, my first value is negative, so we do have to pull out a negative number. So I'm going to pull out negative 8, and we get a positive x minus 3. And what's really important with that is both terms on the inside are still the same. Okay, to rewrite it, I get x minus 8 times x minus 3. And we are done. So then the last one I want to look at is when AC is negative and BX is positive. So AC again, remember 1 times negative 15. It's going to give me negative 15. So now that would give me either negative 3 and 5, negative 5 and 3. Looking at those two options, what's going to give me a positive 2? These two right here. So x squared minus 3x plus 5x minus 15 is what we're starting with. I can factor out an x from the first group. So we get x minus 3. From the second group, I can factor out a positive 5, and I get x minus 3. Both terms, again, are the same. And so my final answer is x plus 5 times x minus 3. And there we go. All of these are factored. So what happens when a does not equal 1? Well, the first one's going to be when all terms are positive. So looking here, AC is going to be 6 times 5, which is 30. So we want to think about numbers that are going to add up to 13 but multiply to 30. So right now off the top of my head, the first thing I thought of was 2 and 15. So, but that won't work because those would be subtracting. So this is where we got to start thinking about some stuff. So let me write that down. So 2 and 15 we know does not work. But 3 and 10 does. So I'm going to go with 3 and 10. I'm going to have 6x squared plus my 3x plus my 10x plus 5. Okay. I'm going to break them up into pieces and factor. So I can pull out a 3x from here, and I get left with 2x plus 1. And then from the second one, I can pull out a 5, and I get left with 2x plus 1. So again, still the same terms on the inside, and we can rewrite this as 3x plus 5 times 2x plus 1. So that's when all of our terms are positive. The second one we're going to look at is when AC is negative, but our middle value B is positive. So first of all, AC is going to equal 3 times negative 15, which gives us negative 45. So if we're thinking about a negative 45, I'm not going to do 1 and 45. Like, we already know that's not going to work. That's not going to get us to 4. So I want to think about numbers that will get me there. So 1 and 45 won't work. 3 and 15 are not going to work. So let's try 5. So 45 divided by 5 gives me 9. So if I have 5 and 9, one of these has to be positive, one has to be negative, and add to 4. So negative 5 plus 9 would give me a positive 4. So that's what we're going to go with. So notice I'm thinking this out. You might have to write down multiple combinations before you get one that works. That's totally okay. So we get 3x squared minus 5x plus 9x minus 15. Now looking at my first grouping here, the only thing I can pull out from here is x. So we get left with 3x minus 5. And then from the second group, the only thing I can pull out is a 3. So we get 3x minus 5. And same terms on the inside. Then our final factored form is going to be x plus 3 times 3x minus 5. Okay, next one we're going to look at is when AC is negative and BX is negative. So AC is going to be negative 6 times 4, which is negative 24. and I want it to add up to -5. So we've done 24, and I'm kind of going through my head. We had 1 and 12, or I'm sorry, 1 and 24, 2 and 12, and then 3 and 8. Thinking about those numbers, 3 and 8 seems like the most logical ones. Now, one of these has to be negative, and if I'm looking at -5, then I'm going to go ahead and say that 8 has to be negative. So this is what we're going to use. So 4x squared plus 3x minus 8x, then minus 6. Again, I'm going to split these up. The only thing I can pull out from my first group is an x, so we get 4x plus 3. And the only thing we can pull out from the second group is a -2. Notice they're both negative. And we get 4x plus 3. So, same thing, same terms. So then finally, it would be x minus 2 times 4x plus 3. That's our answer. Then the last one, when AC is positive and BX is negative. So my AC value here is going to be 3 times 8, which is equal to 24. Now we want to look at terms that are going to add up to -14. So that means both of my terms are going to be negative. And what stands out to me is the numbers 2 and 12. If they're both negative and I add them, they're going to add up to -14. So we're going to split the middle. I'm going to have minus 2x minus 12x plus 3. Again, we're going to break it up into pairs. I can pull a 2x out from my first group, and I'm left with 4x minus 1. I can pull out a -3, negative because my first term is negative. And I'm going to get a positive 4x minus 1. So notice again, middle terms are the same. If you forget to pull out the negative, you'll notice that your terms inside the parentheses are not the same, and you'll have to pull out something else. Then finally, the factored form is 2x minus 3 times 4x minus 1. And that is it for this. So this week, you have your online learning slides. There's a lot more questions than normal, hence why you do not have textbook work this week. These are due by 3 p.m., as always. And then on Friday, you do have a worksheet practice, and you will also have Khan Academy, and both of those are due by 3 p.m. Okay, I will see you all on Wednesday. Please come with questions if you have any, and I would be more than happy to answer them. Okay, bye guys.